Alrighty, guys, welcome to this third session. Today, we're going to talk about assessment of productive skills to continue with the same topic of assessment in EFL. What are productive skills? A simple question. Who can answer fast? Or which ones are productive skills? Sorry?
Speaking and writing.
Very good. So our lesson for today is going to focus on those two, and the next and last session for assessment is going to be next week. Is going to focus on receptive skills, okay? So what are the objectives for today's session? We have here 4 objectives. Maybe Tati, can you please help me out today reading the objectives?
Yeah, sure. Choose the most appropriate speaking method depending on the learning context. Incorporate the most appropriate speaking assessment criteria and or tasks depending on the learning context. Choose the most appropriate writing assessment method depending on the learning context. Incorporate the most appropriate writing assessment criteria and or tasks depending on the learning context.
Very good. Thank you very much. I think Christian was accessing too. Welcome, Christian.
Thank you.
Alrighty, so what are some challenges of assessment of speaking skills? Well, speaking is generally considered to be the measure of knowing a language. It is also one of the most difficult skills language learners have to face. However, traditionally is the least taught and tested of all skills in the classroom. Despite considerable advances in recent years in EFL, there are still considerable challenges in testing speaking. In this session, we will look at why speaking is considered a difficult skill to test, how to choose appropriate methods to successfully test speaking according to the learning context and the evaluation task we should use. Speaking is one of the most important skills of all the 4 language skills because individuals who learn a language are referred to as speakers of that language. However, it is also considered the most difficult skill to master. Just to give you an example, native speakers speak at a rate of 2.5 words per second, which could increase to up 5 words per second. An educated speaker may have a vocabulary of 30,000 words. So it's not an easy task to, it's not an easy skill to test or assess. And here we have 3 questions. Do you test speaking? Yes, we do test speaking, right? We have oral tests in different parts of the program. We have 2 questions here. How can it be done in a large class? We will answer that during this lesson. But the last question, I want to know your opinion. Is it objective? Do you think the way we assess speaking at this moment is objective? I'm attentive to your comments. Nico?
Well, it depends. For example, for the oral test and the placement test, we have a criteria that teachers have to follow. But if you look at a tutorial, there are teachers who are who evaluate the student in a holistic way according to the unit and the communicational objectives. And there are others who focus a lot on grammatical structures and accuracy more than fluency and in general, the ability to communicate.
Thank you. Christian Arias?
Well, I believe that in order to succeed in this item, we should create something as like a sheet in order to look at when we are assessing for what to expect in certain levels in different areas. For example, when you evaluate CAT or MET or any other international exam, you have the thing what to expect. You have like the things that you need to look for when you listen to the student, and maybe you can give a grade according to that. Right now in the oral test, we just listen to them and give them 3 items like uh, poor, fair, and good. But it is a broader understanding and it depends on the teacher. But if we have the sheet, like this is what you need to look for when you are evaluating a student in X level. So look for it. And if the student managed to get the necessary skills or the necessary language, you can place him or her on a level, maybe one to five or something like that.
Thank you for your suggestions. Daniel?
Yeah, I wanted to say that I believe that it's completely subjective the way how we do it here at Jamestown, because I mean, yeah, we have a bank of questions. That's it. Yeah, and we have some general, very general guidelines on how can we, assess the student, but we don't have a document. For example, the band descriptors that we have for IELTS. It would be good to have something like that if we want to really have a like an objective way of assessing a student. And it would be cool to do an exercise like that. I mean, to create something like that and to see the different ways how everyone is going to assess the same student, for example, with a video, it would be great. And I know that we're going to find really funny results because we're going to see that we're going to see really different comments, really different perspectives, really different results. Um, so I believe that no, it's completely subjective. That's not a big problem itself, but it would be good to take the whole process into a more objective process. That's what I believe.
Thank you. Yes, there is a lot of room for improvement. And so we are going to get some ideas today. But what are the challenges of speaking assessment? We have here 6, 7 items. Who wants to help me out reading these items of what are the challenges for speaking assessment?
I will. I can do.
Okay.
Learners need to carry out routine exchanges, for example, when greeting someone or buying a newspaper. Learners need to take part in unpredictable exchanges, for example, casual conversation. Learners need to know when it is appropriate to speak, how they can politely interrupt, and so on. Learners need to monitor what they say so that they can correct if necessary. Learners need to be able to negotiate and manage exchanges, inviting others to speak, asking for repetition, and so on. Learners need to speak with intelligible pronunciation. Learners need to select appropriate vocabulary and use grammar to organize what they say.
Yes, so these challenges can lead learners to display an unwillingness to produce language orally and can eventually lead to foreign language anxiety. When this process takes place as part of an assessment, candidates are often under pressure to produce many features correctly in a very limited time frame. Thus, these challenges become even greater, and anxiety can prevent the candidate from performing, leading to sudden death. You guys remember the concept of sudden death? We saw it last week. And so how can we minimize the foreign language anxiety in the classroom? Teachers can be part of the cause of this anxiety by picking students to speak in class who have not volunteered and would prefer not to participate actively. While learning requires active participation, teachers need to encourage students in a constructive atmosphere that does not feel judgmental. To minimize the onset of a foreign language anxiety and aid students' speaking performance, teachers can do the following. So here we have some tips or suggestions on how to minimize this foreign language anxiety. Any volunteer for reading this slide?
I can do it if you wish, Danny.
Okay, Jorge.
Okay, using formal rather than formal assessment. See previous unit for more information. Create an encouraging classroom atmosphere when children are not picked out, but encouraged to volunteer. If the same hands are constantly raised, wait for a few seconds for the learners to assimilate content and think of their answers. Use think, pair, share activities where students get to work out their answer in groups. Think how to express their thoughts effectively in the foreign language before sharing it with the rest of the class. This technique may increase the number of students who put their hands up voluntarily and can encourage sheer students to participate. Maximize activities where speaking is necessary for communication, but not the sole main focus of the activity. This aids learners to feel accustomed to speaking on a daily basis in a relaxed manner for basic communication. Teach and encourage the use of oral communication strategies. In his book, Communication Strategies, Learning and Teaching How to Manage Oral Interaction, Mariani explains how we can help learners improve their communicative skills through the use of communication strategies that we often use when speaking in our L1, but lack practice or confidence to use in the L2.
Thank you, Jorge. So the use of these strategies can help students feel able to communicate more effectively in the foreign language, therefore helping improve their performance in oral assessment. Okay, so let's keep in mind we are still not assessing. In here, we're just trying to include these concepts in class. We will see some techniques on how to assess during English classes. So like writing, speaking is a productive skills, which means assessment is subjective in nature rather than objective. Objectively can be increased by the correct use of rubrics and making scales to standardize marking. In contrast to writing, spontaneous spoken language is produced in short units, which can be correct while not adhering to standard grammar. This is in contrast to written language, which uses long sentences with much more formalized grammar rules. Something really important to notice, guys, is that in a face-to-face exam, language is not the only variable. The physical presence of the candidate can unconsciously influence the assessor and increase the subjectivity of the rating. The assessor cannot, at least subconsciously, avoid being influenced by the candidate's physical presence and sympathy, or lack of it. Age, race, or gender can all affect bias. Although extensive training helps minimize bias, this human element should still be noted. No speaking exam of this type can be 100% objective and 100% based on the candidate's performance. Therefore, assessors need extensive training and have clear criteria against which a candidate is assessed to establish their level in the form of a rubric or rating. However, extensive training requires time and money. Similarly, the number of examiners required also makes it a costly exercise. Speaking exams are more time-consuming and costly due to the number of assessors required. Just to give you an example, IELTS, it's not easy to find IELTS examiners. The training is long, the requirements are high. And so those are some of the cons of having a more objective assessment. So to summarize, guys, possible variables that might affect speaking exams are personal characteristics like age, sex, language, proficiency level, type of general education. These things should be considered while preparing assessment tasks. Knowledge of the word. Task should not require specific knowledge of the word. Emotional response. Topics like death, natural disasters, diseases might affect some learners negatively. Potentially controversial topics such as religion, politics are also to be avoided. So what are your thoughts on this? Do you think, or have you experienced when you are assessing students in tutorials or in oral tests, that you are affected by personal characteristics or the word knowledge or emotional response from the student in your grades? Anyone? Nico?
Well, of course, we try to be the most objective we can. But I actually wanted to give an example of the opposite situation, a student affected by the questions that we make or the type of evaluation. So I remember very clearly this case in which the student, prior to the tutorial, had a family tragedy. They assassinated her parents, and of course the tutorial was about family. So when I was asking question about her parents, she just cracked and started to cry. So it was very uncomfortable for me as a teacher. Never happened to me before, and for the rest of the students, including her. So I think that's a very good example of what we're discussing. Um, a specific example of how I have been affected by a student before that I can remember, no, but I remember clearly that example that I mentioned.
Yeah, I remember there was a teacher here who always have problem in, well, not always, I don't want to be general, but in many cases he had problems with uh, with with young girls or with female students, and he was, on the other hand, really kind and polite with male students. And so the opposite can also happen. Also, maybe in an oral test, if you take a look too much at the physical appearance, that might affect, or if you are friends with the student somehow, that might affect also your scoring of the speaking. I think it has happened to all of us at some point. But it's good that we now are aware of the implications of that. And once you're self-aware of this, then you can start improving and helping others to improve on that matter. Anybody else wants to comment on that? All right, so let's move on to the next slide. Another factor to consider in the assessment is the assessment format. Speaking examinations can be held individually, one or two examiners at one candidate, or in pairs, two examiners and two candidates. For formal examinations, it is preferable to have a minimum of two examiners present to ensure fairness and objectivity in grading. So in the next slides, we are going to see 5 different models for speaking assessment. Let's begin with the first one. Take a look at the image. So in here, we have one candidate who interacts with the assessor. This is the most common model, but it has the complication for the assessor who must act as speaker, listener, and assessor simultaneously. It can be difficult to appear interested in answers while assessing what candidate is saying and simultaneously thinking on the next task. It is also very tiring, with frequent breaks necessary to remain fully attentive. It should also be noted that the assessor should remain as impartial and objective as possible. But in this model, with the assessor interacting with the test taker, this might be more challenging. Which, do you think we use this model in any of the classes? In which classes?
Yeah, of course, in tutorials.
In tutorials, very good.
Tutorials and oral tests.
Sometimes if you have only one student.
When you have one student.
Yes, you will
Yes.
be the assessor, the listener, and also the speaker. All right. So let's move on to the next model. In this model, there are three people: the test taker, the interlocutor, and the assessor. As the interlocutor is distinct from the assessor, they are able to focus their full attention on managing the discussion. And likewise, the assessor can focus their full attention on assessing. Here, the speaker must perform in front of two people, which can be more difficult for some learners. In this model, the assessor's job is much simplified compared to that in figure number 1. Maybe Christian can tell us better, where do they use this model?
That's in the CAT exam.
So yes, in Cambridge exams, I think all Cambridge exams.
And PET, CAT and PET, but
also in CAE, when I
don't know
took
that
it.
one because
Yeah?
I haven't been trained for that one.
Okay, yes, I think, Christian, in all of Cambridge ESOL exams, they use this model.
They call it the main suite, but CELTA, but IELTS. IELTS is just one evaluator.
Exactly, we will see that one later. But in this case, in all Cambridge exams, for those of you who have taken the CAE, am I the only one? Yes. And also the CPE is the same model. You are in front of two examiners, but you might have another classmate with you, or you might have you have another person, another classmate with you.
Maybe you can have even two other classmates.
Yes.
The only thing is that the interlocutor is assessing some specific areas, like the overall of your performance, and the assessor is going to your vocabulary, to your grammar, to pronunciation, everything else.
Yes, in fact, just for your information, guys, this model is called the Oral Proficiency Interview, or OPI, okay? Where one candidate is interviewed by an assessor or an interlocutor, with the variation that the interlocutor and assessor continuously swap roles, which is each task, taking turns to interact or assess. The Oral Proficiency Interview is an integrative performance test widely used to assess speaking in high-stakes exam, and especially by governmental institutions around the world. As we just mentioned, this is the case with Cambridge exams. Now, what is the third speaking model? This third figure represents an oral test situation between two candidates who interact plus the assessor. As the responsibility for keeping the conversation going is dependent on the candidates, the assessor listens without intervening and can place full attention on assessing. Each candidate is interacting with another candidate of a similar level, which can be less intimidating. This can be adapted for use in formal and informal testing situations. Now, again, do we use this model?
Yeah, again, all the time in tutorials and in oral tests.
Very good. Okay. Now we're going to see one more model. In this one, a group of 3 to 6 learners carry out a task. The assessor remains silent limited to observing and assessing. Peers tend to be less intimidated, and this method may produce highly authentic language and also creativity. It has the advantage of requiring less examining time overall, as various candidates are evaluated simultaneously. And even though each session may run out a little longer than the other models, overall is shorter or takes less time than the others. This model is extremely tiring for the assessor who must evaluate each candidate's performance. The recommendation is giving an approximate rating to the prominent group members and then concentrating on every aspect of the less talkative members. I think we also use this sometimes, maybe if we have bigger tutorials, if we have clubs where we want everybody to speak. So the teacher takes more a role of a listener and is silent and observing and assessing, right? And then the last one, I'm sorry, I went back. The fifth model represents recorded oral testing on a computer where the candidate's performance is recorded and then assessed later. The challenge for the candidate is to think of things to say and produce authentic speech without being able to interact with another person, read body language, or get immediate feedback on their performance. A major advantage to this model is the time and cost saved. So based on these 5 models, in the different stages that we have in our program, which one or which ones best suits our needs? What are your thoughts?
I
Well,
think that
Ella?
will I think that will depend on what we're evaluating. For example, for tutorials and oral tests, depend on how many students we have in the session. And this last one, number 4, I think it's a good idea for um, the screening test or the mock tests during IELTS preparations. I think it's more effective for us as we have big groups of students. But I think we can use all of them depending on the type of class we're assessing.
Anybody else?
I think no one model um, suits Jamestown. I think depending on the different types of tests that we have and the different situations, we might need to use different models. Even exams, sometimes part 1 uses a specific model, and then part 2 uses another model, then part 3 uses another model. So I think a good mix of different models is what would suit us best.
Nico?
yeah, again, I agree with both because even if and even if no, if we consider that students are not going to stop their learning process after Jamestown, you will see that in a lot of in different institutions they use different models. So I've seen places where they do a computer-based speaking test. I've seen places where they have oral interviews. So again, I think it's important for them, both for us and both for their careers and their futures, to have a mix of these type of evaluations.
Christian?
Well, I believe that even though we do use different models, the thing that we all need is to work with the rubric in order to become it a bit more objective, not to let the final evaluation or the final grade just to how does the teacher feel or think about the interaction. We should have something in which we can follow, something that we can rely on in order to give our final assessment.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, and I agree with all of you. In fact, I think students should be presented all these kind of tests or testing techniques because not only they benefit from it, but we also can use the different techniques depending on our needs. For example, I don't remember, Nico, if you shared this with everybody, but in Ibagué, they are going to do the speaking for IELTS in a recorded format, which I think is going to be much more time saving.
Yeah, no,
I don't remember if you mentioned it to everybody, or maybe you can summarize a little bit what you guys are doing.
all right. So basically, we've been working on a Google Forms kind of format for our mock test. So the idea for this year is for students to be able to record themselves. So they are shown the questions in a presentation, they record themselves, and we are working on a way of making the process automatic in which they record and they upload the information to our trainers. So similar to Google Formats, we are looking at the possibility of using Google Formats to upload the file directly, and the trainers will only have to enter, let's call it a sheet, let's say Google Sheet, and they would have only to click the link and they will listen and evaluate the student to save time, have the process in a more efficient way, and be able to work faster and more efficiently.
Yes,
I
and
think
yes, go ahead, Cherry.
I think there are two things to consider here. Is what suits the institution on one hand, and then what suits the students, what's in the students' best interest. So on the one hand, we save time, we use our resources more effectively from our perspective. But then if we use certain modules, it may not help the student in the long run with what the final objective is. Versus if we do it the other way, where it probably um, wastes or resources, if you want to call it that, but in the long run, it helps the student, achieve the goal that they want to achieve. So sometimes we're faced with that dilemma. Um, in order to make like the correct decision, we need to find that compromise. What can suit the company so that we don't waste resources, but at the same time we give the students what they need for the objectives that they want to achieve.
Totally agree, Chevy.
Yeah,
And
I would like to say
but
something.
there are some points in the program, like if we want to include an oral test in the screening process, for example, this will be an excellent idea because we don't have to actually have a teacher just waiting there for the students to once in a while take a screening class, but rather they will just record the answers and upload them. So it will be easier for us to determine who's ready and who's not. But also, as you said, if the final or the end goal is for them to take IELTS, then definitely at least one of the mock tests, especially the last one, should be as realistic as possible, right? Alrighty, guys,
Danny,
let's
but
move on. Yep, go ahead.
I have a question. Let's say that we start recording all the answers. Then, when the teachers, the IELTS teachers, are going to check all these, because imagine having, I don't know, 20, 25, yes, recordings. So are they gonna do it during their shift, or are we gonna give them extra hours to do it, or how is it
Well,
gonna be?
I wouldn't talk about that right now because that is not the purpose of the training session. But as they test it and try it and improve it in Ibagué, then we can see the pros and cons and if it's suitable for the rest of the branches or not. Okay.
Okay, sure.
So let's move on. Let's talk now about elicitation techniques. So something that should also be taken into consideration is that students perform different oral tasks at different levels. This is not always only dependent on the student's ability to express themselves in English, but also about the wider knowledge of other subjects. For advanced level exams, where the use of English to explain abstract ideas and opinions is being assessed, some students are not used to expressing these ideas even in their first language. So attempting to do so in a foreign language becomes a very challenging task. The same is true for formal and informal register. This situation has prompted examining bodies such as Cambridge English to produce different different editions for the same exam level, such as CET and PET and first certificate for schools, where topics are appropriate for the school student. So here we have some techniques or common tasks that are used to assess speaking. They are often used in conjunction with another of the same list. Possible tasks to assess speaking are, so here we have a list. If you guys can help me out, maybe 2 volunteers, so we can read half and half. We have 2, 4, 6, 8. The first person can read the first 4 and the other person the other 4. Anybody? Okay.
Choosing an elicitation technique. Personal information. The candidate speaks about their family, school, town, etc. Comparing things, often comparing visual prompts. Telling or retelling a story. The candidate tells a story based on several images. Reading aloud. This does not allow spontaneous speech and is reliant on developed reading skills. This method is not recommended for evaluating communicative competence. Interview questions and answers. The examiner asks the candidate a series of questions which start from easier before becoming increasingly complex.
Thank you. The next person.
I can do it.
Okay.
Interview questions and answers. The examiner, no, I'm sorry. Role play?
Yes.
I'm sorry. Role plays. They may use two candidates interacting, or if only one candidate is present, the examiner takes one role and the candidate the other. Giving a speech, complex tasks reserved for very high levels, usually in OPIs. The candidate must use the appropriate register according to the imagined audience. Class activity. In informal assessment, any class activity which produces spontaneous speech can be used to assess informally. These are normally group tasks to ensure interaction.
Now, which of these elicitation techniques you don't use very often, but would like to include in your classes?
I would say telling a story. I think it's a good strategy, but I don't really use it very often.
Great. Anybody else? I saw Christian was raising his hand.
Well, I'm thinking about it. That the only one that I haven't tried yet is like giving a speech, but it's because of the level of the student. But sometimes on a higher level, I remember last year when I was with an advanced club, wasn't a speaking club by the way, and they managed to do it, and it was very good. I just stood there, like listening, no more.
Great. Anybody else?
Maybe role plays. It would be interesting, given the communicative approach that we manage, to create role plays during the oral tests or quiz or tutorials. I know that in tutorials we do it more often, but in oral test normally is more of a direct conversation type of test. So role plays are a good way of making the student like feel less self-conscious Sometimes they don't want to share personal information. They feel uncomfortable with it. So I think role play would be a good idea to take them out of that mindset.
Yes, that's an excellent comment, Nico. In fact, many students might be too shy or might have problems. We don't know what kind of life do they have or what are they struggling with. Where start asking personal questions about their father, their family members, and it's not that they don't speak English enough, but they don't want to share that kind of information with us. So role plays are an excellent way to try something different whenever that direct approach doesn't work, right? Great. Now, this is it for speaking. Now we're going to move on to the next skill, which is writing. So for students to be assessed in a skill, they first must learn and practice that skill. So in this part of the lesson, we will start by taking a look at ways to incorporate writing into the classroom. And then we will look at different test types frequently used to assess writing. So while writing is generally believed to be an easier skill to teach and assess than speaking, the problem is, or the question is, how can it be taught successfully? And sometimes maybe you recognize a good piece of writing when you read it, but what makes it good? How can a student who writes poorly be taught to write well? So it can feel like a huge task. So for the teacher, incorporating writing activities into the classroom sometimes can feel like creating even more marking or an extra load of work. Many teachers feel considerable pressure for pupils to perform well in writing skills, especially when those skills are assessed formally, like in IELTS. Teachers use that pressure of having to teach to test. You remember the watchback effect we saw? So they start teaching only what's going to be tested. So in the next slides, we will see some activities that can be adapted to be used in something similar to a contest in order to provide more motivations for our students. So here we have 4 aspects or stages that need to be followed when writing contests in the classroom. The stage number 1 is genre exploration. This means collect winning contest entries that can be used as mentor texts for your specific grade level and writing purpose. Read winning contest entries with your students. Focus on the use of leads, endings, details, word choice, and other writing techniques explored in writing workshops. You can use discussions to help students understand that writing for contests supports their assessment preparation. Why so? And why we want to use maybe contests or writing contests in our classes? Because when you write for a contest, you don't know who is the audience. And the purpose of a contest might include employment, competition, and evaluation. So it's a good way to prepare students for writing tasks for a high stakes exam. So the second stage is modeling. In this stage, we need to select a writing that was used in the context. We need to read the guidelines, rules, and rubric so that the students have a framework where they're going to work. You then can select a personal topic and start writing your first draft. You can use the board so your thoughts become visible and encourage the students to participate and offer ideas. The third stage is writing. In this stage, you provide students with a writing contest prompt, and the students should consider their audience, self-evaluate their work based on the writing contest guidelines, rules, and rubric, and choose if they are ready to submit the entry to the contest. The last stage will be to students share. So they will share their responses with a partner or a small group. And this is useful because it gets students noticing mistakes. And it's normally easier to spot mistakes that someone else is making than your own. Then after the teacher provides feedback, then the students rewrite their responses, and then they once again do self-assessment, peer assessment, and spelling check. This provides plenty of opportunities for students of all levels to practice the type of writing that you expect them to do on the writing test. So once again, guys, we cannot test a skill that we are not actually practicing with students. So it's important, I have always thought that it's important for us to include more writing exercises in our program, because they struggle a lot at the end of the program when they are in the IELTS preparation to perform those tasks. What are your thoughts on that? Daniel?
Yeah, I believe that I've always thought that we should have a writing test every 2 units at least, in which we give students a task to perform, because sometimes they're great speaking, they're great, like understanding what they have to do. But when they have to create something and when they have to really think of what they are going to write, they have really big problems doing that. So I'd say that, yes, definitely. Writing is like something that we expect them to do. We expect them to do well when they reach the IELTS preparation stage, but we're not really, like teaching anything related to that apart from clubs and the writing clubs we have. But I believe that we should have a more, how to say it, more formal introduction and a more formal writing assessment in the course, because I believe that it's absolutely necessary. So I've always thought that a writing test would be good every 2 units.
Thank you, Daniel. Anybody else?
Well, Daniel, I remember when I was when I worked as a monitor a long time ago. I used to check students' book, and for example, during the listening exercises, they used to write just one word, yes, and I used to tell them you have to write complete sentences, and even with these instructions, they tried to do it, and then um, I would check again, and there were a lot of mistakes. So I think they try to avoid these kind of exercises, or even the writing section. They had the modeling there. They had the context and one example, and even with all these things, they they were not able to do it. So I think the lab is a good moment to practice writing, but they need guidance. Otherwise, they are not gonna take advantage of all the material they have in the books, because in some units they have a specific um, abilities to be practiced, and I don't know if they are using them or not, because they need a lot of help from monitors to do this, or the teachers. If we could include a writing class every unit, that could be also a good idea.
Yes, we have to be careful there sometimes. I remember some complaints, you know, in these many years in the company, you hear everything. But I remember about one teacher that was, his tutorials were like, okay, so you're going to do this writing paragraph for 35 minutes. And then the teacher was just looking at the cell phone for 35 minutes and then checking students' answers at the end. So that's not the idea of it. So we have to be balanced with that. So we're going to see some guidelines to design writing activities. We have three different charts here. The first one is context and content. I need one volunteer for that one, context and content. Anybody? Alexis?
Yes, sure. Guidelines to design writing activities, context, place of writing tasks in course objectives, a curriculum or long-term program goals, students' capabilities, limitations, and learning objectives, criteria, reasons for the assignment, authentic real-life context, content, accessible to all students, writers, culturally and otherwise, authentic audience and purposes, appropriately rich, for example, allowing for multiple approaches.
Thank you. Anybody else for the next chart? Task, rhetorical specifications, and evaluation. Chevy?
Good.
Tasks appropriately focused to accomplish within external parameters, for example, time constraints. Further student knowledge of classroom content and skills. Allow students to demonstrate their knowledge. Engaging, interesting, involving. Rhetorical specifications. Clear direction concerning shape and format. Instructions concerning register and tone, that is, audience relationships. Adequate rhetorical cues. Evaluation assesses what is being taught. Clear, specific, unambiguous criteria articulated to students or writers.
Thank you. And one more person for the last chart.
I can do it.
Okay.
Guidelines to design writing activities, instructions, comprehensible, as brief as clarity allows, unambiguous, prompt, vocabulary and syntax appropriately simple or complex, transparent, easy to interpret.
Thank you, guys. So as I always do, I'm going to send you this PDF so you can maybe take a look on deep at these guidelines, reflect on them, and see how can you start applying them on your next classes or on your clubs, and also how can you teach teachers on how to include them in their classes. Now, what are some elicitation techniques that we can use when writing items and prompts? We have here a list that, because of the time, we are not going to consider one by one, but you can take a quick look at the list. We have dictation, summary, sentence building, among others, and some examples on how to do it. Now here we have a very nice example of how simple sometimes it is to include writing in our classes. We don't really need a lot of resources to start writing. This is just an example of what you can do in the board. Just a couple of words, and then you can start writing. Can you give me a quick idea of how to use this graphic in a writing class, maybe for beginners? Just by taking a look at what you see on the screen.
Like the context, Daniel?
Yes, how would you use this simple exercise with a basic class?
Yeah, so I would start with, for example, we're working on past simple. So I would make them describe their weekend or an event on the weekend, and I would use the prompts that you have there to help them organize their ideas and write them down.
Great. Any other idea, Daniel?
Well, the first thing that came to my mind was Shrek. I don't know why.
Yeah.
Probably because they have that story. I mean that way of presenting the story, which they have the book and they open it and they start setting the story. So I think that I would use a story that everybody knows, probably Shrek. I don't know, it's very popular, and ask them to have a really really summary of what happened in Shrek,
Oh,
and to create a story, a simple story like that. I mean, once upon a time there was a yes, and something like that, but with simple vocabulary. So, for example, I'm not sure of how to say it in English. Caperucita Roja, Cape Red, I think it's
Little Red Riding Hood.
little. Okay, yeah. So, a story like that, that it's really simple, in which there are really simple vocabulary. So, yeah, something like that.
I actually thought of the same thing, but just to find like a universal fairy tale that we all know, and then have them create different versions of it or a different ending. So let's say, I don't know, the Three Little Pigs or something that's a lot more universal, and then ask them to tell their own version, just to be creative and give their own versions of it. Yeah.
Great. So there are multiple ways of how to use such a simple exercise in a writing class. So here we have effective assessment. So according to Rate and Kroll, an effective writing assessment should bear in mind the following factors: learning objectives, individual students' factors, contextualize, authentic, and closely linked to the classroom work, link between class objectives and real world, based on accessible content, be engaging, be developed in tandem with appropriate evaluation criteria that reflect course goals. So even though there are simple activities as the one we just practiced, we have to bear in mind that if we are going to assess effectively, we need to take into consideration several things, as we saw during this lesson. So the exit slip for today: give me feedback, take your pick, what you liked or didn't like, what you learned, what was repeated, and what you will put into practice. Anybody? Take your pick.
I believe that, well, when you talk about what will you put into practice, we have to take it into consideration. I know I will, the part of the writing, like when it's possible, let them work with that writing. I think we have been like so against it. I mean, personally, I have been so against it. But now that you open it, like it doesn't have to be so difficult or so complicated, just in order to work with a small writing.
Thank you, Chris. Anybody else? Elaine?
Yes. What you will put into practice? I I used to work with writing workshops for a university, and I think it should be important for us to train our teachers in writing, because writing is not just put letters into a paper or just typing in a computer. I mean, writing has an objective. What are you writing? Why are you writing? Who is going to read what you're writing? So I think it would be interesting if we could put this into practice with our teachers before organizing, evaluating, or assessing students in writing in a different way, because I don't think they have this, they have considered this as a different way of assessing students. I think either writing and speaking are taken for granted sometimes when we are evaluating, and it's kind of subjective. I think practicing this kind of writing techniques with teachers will help us a lot.
Thank you, Ella. We have time for one more comment. Take your pick. Who wants to share the final thoughts? Anybody? Well, there are lots of things that we can put into practice. Remember the models that we saw for the speaking assessment. So I'm sure you can benefit from reviewing the information, as I mentioned before, and try to apply the information that we just saw first with your classes, and then try to share this information with your teaching staff. Okay, so guys, thank you very much for your attention.